Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm Elizabeth Falter. I'm the digital media specialist in the Department of English, and I will serve as your moderator today. Thank you so much for joining us for book club. Today, we will discuss Dracula by Bram Stoker, selected by Department of English leaders and faculty. A big thank you to Hannibal Hamlin, Interim Director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Professor in the Department of English, and Karen Winstead, Professor in the Department of English, for sharing their expertise with us today. Hannibal and Karen will get started with some opening remarks about Dracula. We will then turn the conversation over to your questions and comments. Karen, take it away.
Okay. I am going to start by sharing my screen. Thank you everybody for being here. Let me go to, can you see my image? What are you looking at? Is it a duck or is it perhaps a rabbit? It could be either. It is both. It's a paradox. This image first appeared in 1892, about 7 years before Bram Stoker's Dracula was published. You may be familiar with the same visual phenomenon seen in this image, the the so-called Rubin vase. Is this a vase or are you seeing two faces? It could be either, it's both. And what I love most about Dracula is that I believe it is the equivalent, literary equivalent of those images that have two radically different possible interpretations in one. Dracula begins with an assertion that it's going to relay a history almost at variance with the possibility of later day belief. And this will stand forth as simple fact. It ends with the narrator, one of the narrators declaring that in all the massive material of which this record is composed, there is hardly one authentic document. We could hardly ask anyone to accept these as proofs of so wild a story. And so what is Dracula? Is it simple fact? Is it a wild story? Or put differently, and I will stop share here, is there a vampire in the fictional world of Bram Stoker's Dracula? Dracula, I will argue, can be read two ways. It can be read as it is most commonly read as the straightforward story of a vampire, or it can be read as the story of what was called at the time shared psychosis, folie à plusieurs, folie à deux, infectious hallucination that was very, very much talked about in the medical literature and the popular press at the time. A shared psychosis, in other words, that is orchestrated by Dr. Van Helsing, a lonely old physician in search of admiration and obedience, a skilled hypnotist. All right, let's start with young Jonathan Harker, a newly minted solicitor who ventures forth on his first business trip, his first major business trip into a land whose customs and languages he doesn't understand, whose food gives him indigestion, whose trains don't run on time. Young Jonathan Harker is pretty unsettled by the time he gets to Castle Dracula. And then he's confronted with a very eccentric host who keeps him up late at night. By the time Jonathan Harker escapes Castle Dracula, there is no doubt that he has had a mental breakdown. The question is whether his diary is a more or less accurate account of the horrors that caused him to lose his mind, or whether what he is describing, the horrors that he's describing in his journal, is the product of his mental breakdown. All right. Then at about the same time that Jonathan Harker is having his adventures in Transylvania, we have the friend of Jonathan's wife, Mina, Lucy Westendra, who is suffering from a mysterious disease that her friend and physician, the mental doctor who is running a lunatic asylum, can't diagnose himself, so he calls in the expert, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing. Abraham Van Helsing can't save Lucy. She dies in his care, and he tries to convince everybody that she was the victim of a vampire predation. Van Helsing, in his search for proof that there is a vampire, brings the stories of Jonathan Harker and Lucy Westendra together, and the hunt for the vampire begins. Now, what is really interesting to me about the way Dracula is put together is that it's all narrated from the perspective of characters whose point of view may be compromised, and indeed who were repeatedly told they're young, they're vulnerable, they're bereaved, they're anxious, they're suffering from depression, they haven't slept, they are taking sedatives, they're not sure whether they're dreaming or whether they're waking, they wonder whether they're losing their minds. And these qualifications are constantly being told to the reader of Dracula. What's more, we never get the same incidents recounted independently from two narrators, as we do say in other first-person narrations, like Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White or The Moonstone. So you only have these characters saying what they believe to be happening. And then finally, you have all of the evidence. Everything is destroyed, and there is no indication that anything has taken place. For every single supernatural occurrence, we are given the possibility of a natural explanation. And so this is a narrative choice on Bram Stoker's part, which is really, really interesting and which is not necessary. Now, Bram Stoker was at the time he was writing, many vampire stories that were being composed in the late 19th century, from about the mid to the late 19th century, were being written in a way that the vampire is explainable. In other words, it's not obvious, it's not inevitable that there is a vampire in the story. These stories are often recounted in the first person by a character who has heard the story of the vampire from a friend or a friend of the friend, like the classic urban legend situation. You often have them reporting things that they remembered that happened a long, long, long time ago, and they don't quite remember if they got it right or if they remembered it properly, or maybe if they were dreaming at the time. So this ambiguity in vampire stories was a feature of Victorian fiction. And that changes. And I think that's why we very rarely see the possibility of Dracula as being a story that is about mental illness. In our own world, in the vampire stories that we read, from Twilight to I don't know, What We Do in the Shadows or Lost Girls or any of the popular vampire stories that I can think of that were composed in the 20th and 21st centuries, it doesn't even make any sense to ask whether there is a vampire in the fictional universe of Twilight. It's not a question you can ask and have it make any sense. And the fact that we can ask it of Dracula says something about the way that this text is put together. So, in conclusion, I'm not arguing that Dracula is not the story of a vampire. I am arguing that it can be read equally well in two ways, as that conventional vampire story or as a story of shared psychosis, a phenomenon that was very much in vogue at the time and that's suggested by the constant reflections of characters in the novel that the line between fiction and reality, between sanity and insanity, is a very thin line, and it's sometimes impossible to tell the difference. And that, by the way, that observation is what doctors were making in the medical literature about shared psychosis. The physician can be in the presence of this phenomenon and not really know whether what their patients are telling them actually happened or whether they are collectively imagining it. So I will leave you with those thoughts now and turn it over to Hannibal.
Thank you, Karen. I also have a PowerPoint, which I'll talk through, and I want to share a few thoughts with you, mainly thinking about the long and really remarkable afterlife of this novel. There aren't very many authors in the history of English literature who have managed to create a lasting myth. We think back to the Greek and Roman and Norse myths, but Dracula and Frankenstein in the 19th century have really essentially turned into modern myths. And I think there's some interesting things about the way in which the stories have changed and morphed over the century. So the next slide. This is these are images from various films of Dracula, and you might notice that the first one here is not called Dracula but Nosferatu, but there's some reason for still including it as a Dracula film. F.W. Murnau wanted to make a film of Dracula, but he wasn't, for legal reasons, able to. He couldn't get the rights, I think, from Stoker's wife. So he had to make a film with a different title instead, but essentially it's the Dracula story, and his character here is a Dracula. Max Schreck, famous in this role. And one thing that's interesting about the versions of Dracula over the decades is that some of them, like this one, follow signs in the novel that clearly suggest that Dracula is inhuman in some fundamental way. He turns into, for instance, all sorts of animals. He's a wolf, he's a dog, he's a bat. And there's a sense in which even when he's in a human form, that there is something sort of animalistic about him. And this clearly is sort of following along those lines. He's got these crazy hands and he looks kind of bat-like. So the next image, this one will be very familiar to you. Oh, no, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a remake of Nosferatu, which is actually my favorite vampire film, in 1979 by Werner Herzog. And Klaus Kinski here is not only sort of following in the footsteps of Max Schreck, but taking it even further. You see those bat ears are even more pronounced, and he's got those strange teeth coming out of his mouth that really, I mean, he's obviously, the sci-fi term would be humanoid, but there is also something, bat-like, rodent-like about him that keeps us from thinking of him as entirely human. So in the next image, then, this is the one I was thinking about. Here's famous Bela Lugosi. Lugosi is one of the most famous vampires in film history. This is a film by Todd Browning from the early 30s, based on a play. Dracula actually was turned into a drama and very popular on British and American stages. But here, this count looks he looks foreign. I mean, of course, Lugosi, I think, was Hungarian, but he is distinctly human. There's nothing bat-like or rodent-like about him, and he's quite an elegant-looking man, even if he is somewhat archaic and also somewhat foreign-looking. And if we move on to the next one, Christopher Lee, following along those same lines. This is obviously, he looks a little less than fully human when he's got blood dripping down from his mouth. But in Christopher Lee's film, I mean, he too looks like a very distinguished aristocratic figure, and actually quite a handsome man. Not again like that sort of animal we saw from earlier ones. And the next slide, I think, takes us to, yes. So with Frank Langella in 1979, in John Badham's film, we have the first sexy Dracula. And this is something that then gets developed further and further and further over the next decades, that there is something sexually charismatic about Dracula. And we have all sorts of Draculas who are beautiful young men, who are physically charismatic. And this, I'm sticking to the Dracula story per se, but as Karen mentioned, we have a whole proliferation of other vampire stories. And a lot of them that end up, some of the ones on television are almost kind of soft porn in the way that they play up the eroticism of the vampire story. It is, though, rooted in Stoker's novel, which, of course, features most prominently and centrally the exchange of bodily fluids, so that there, in a weird way, there is something erotic about this sort of drinking of blood and the embrace of men and women. And this is, anyway, this is a development that then gets picked up. And the next slide. This is from, I don't know if any of you are fans of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There was a movie and then a popular TV series. And here you can see Dracula makes an appearance in that show. And again, very handsome. I think this was a German actor, so they wanted to preserve some sense of his foreignness. But he's young, he's beautiful, he's attractive. And that's the vampire they go for. And the next slide. Claes Bang, a little bit older. This is very interesting, I thought, really quite good miniseries just a couple of years ago, written by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat. Slightly older figure, but again, and also foreign. Also, I think he's Dutch, Claes Bang, but very handsome, very arresting, and very, really, at least in this mode, human. So the next slide. One of the most famous recent films, certainly, of Dracula is Francis Ford Coppola's, which also has a slightly weird title that's, again, only due to copyright issues. He had to call it Bram Stoker's Dracula rather than just Dracula, but it's Dracula, obviously. And actually, this is one of the closest films to the original novel. And here's Gary Oldman. And Gary Oldman goes through a number of different images throughout the film. Interestingly, representing all, I think, of the different possibilities for looking like Dracula. Here he looks, I don't know if one would, I mean, I leave it to you whether you think he's an attractive figure, but he's certainly a charismatic young man, even if, again, sort of foreign and exotic. But if we go to the next slide, this is how Jonathan Harker first encounters him, this strange, wizened old man with a hairstyle that has never been seen on Earth, that makes him really look, I mean, it's hard to know. There's something sort of weirdly inhuman about this. And this image doesn't show you it, but the hair culminates in a kind of long rat tail that runs down his back. Very odd looking. And then in the next slide, he actually has several scenes where we see him as this kind of monstrous giant bat figure. So Coppola is ringing the changes on Dracula. We have all the different versions of him combined into the single film. Now, the next slide, where do we go from here? Oh, yes. Well, I was looking at the sort of long history. Dracula finds his way into popular culture. Here he is in a 1960s cartoon by Chuck Jones with Dracula and Bugs Bunny, Transylvania 65000. And then in the next slide, he even becomes a breakfast cereal. In 1971, General Mills issues along with Frankenberry and Booberry, Count Chocula, which apparently, I hadn't realized this, but apparently it's only sold or produced during the months leading up to Halloween. I'm not sure I've had it. It's not a cereal that particularly attracts me, but there he is, lodged in popular culture. And the next slide. I mean, I grew up, as many did, with the Count on Sesame Street, who is, he's called the Count, obviously because he's Count Dracula, but also because all of his little features have to do with counting and with numbers. And I don't think, this is obviously far past my childhood, but here he is sharing a song with Billie Eilish, oddly enough. The next slide. This is interesting because The Simpsons, not surprisingly, I mean, there's a Simpsons episode for almost everything, but they have a vampire episode, a Dracula episode. And not only is it an episode that includes Dracula, but as you can tell from the hairstyle here, it's specifically the Dracula from Coppola's film with Gary Oldman all dressed up. Although in this case, I think he also looks rather like Mr. Burns, playing around in various ways. So the next slide. Okay, I want to close by thinking about a variety of implications of later Dracula stories that draw out elements of the original novel, but adapt them to different circumstances. And this, in this first instance, I mean, Karen was raising the question of whether there is even a vampire in this novel, or whether there is some kind of shared psychosis. But vampirism also has proved remarkably adaptive over the years to notions of different kinds of contagion. You know, and part of it has to do with the fact that the victims of the vampire are mysterious. You know, they either disappear or they wither away for reasons that the doctors can't seem to figure out. Maybe they notice a couple of little puncture wounds, but they just die mysteriously, which is not unlike how people die from various contagions. I should, this is sort of weirdly relevant. I'm zooming to you in with the coronavirus myself. I was looking around to see if there's a vampire story with the coronavirus, but there isn't one. But in this case, for instance, vampirism and plague, let's look at the next slide. This is the Werner Herzog film again. And Herzog, he's famous for doing crazy things in his movies, and he got his assistants to round up hundreds, if not thousands, of these rats because he wanted to emphasize or at least suggest that the vampire is something like a sort of plague visiting, in this case, the city of Amsterdam. He transplants it back across the channel. Just a sort of odd little fun fact, the assistants sadly could only produce rats that weren't white enough for Herzog, so then he ordered them also to die, every single rat. And the next slide, if you show it, this is a sort of strange stylized city scene, but you can see all these people carrying coffins out into the square, and nobody knows yet what the cause of all of this is. We know that it's the vampire. We know that it's Nosferatu or Dracula, but the citizens of the city feel that they've just been visited by a plague. And the next scene, he features these bizarre scenes with, here's this dead woman in a chair with farm animals sort of taking over the market square. And in the next slide, here's a group of people who all feel that they've got the plague, whereas really they've just been bitten by the vampire. And they're kind of feasting in a kind of wild abandon, their last moments on Earth. And you can see the rats are still scurrying around underneath. So Herzog is really sort of bringing into alignment the vampire and the kind of plague that afflicted Europe over so many centuries. Now, on the next slide, this is something that a lot of people have written about. The film that Coppola made was it was a later film, and in the midst of the AIDS crisis. And I think it's not as if Coppola turned the film into something solely about AIDS, but he went in it. Instead of playing up the connections to the plague, he makes suggestions about vampirism and AIDS, which are perfectly logical. Again, if you think about the way in which blood is central to the vampire story, and blood, of course, is central to the transmission of AIDS, or the exchange of any number of different, various different bodily fluids. So in the next slide, here Coppola, he plays up the eroticism in Stoker, and there are a number of these scenes in Dracula's castle where a very innocent looking Keanu Reeves is sort of cajoled, embraced, poked, prodded by this strange elderly Dracula, even in his bathroom. The next slide. There's a bizarre scene where Dracula shows up and shaves Harker. I don't include the slide, but then he nicks Harker and then has a sort of weird moment where he licks the blood off of the razor again in a sort of like grotesquely erotic moment. And the slide next. This is actually in the novel. The novel includes, the science is very much a part of the novel, and they do try to cure Lucy or save Lucy by means of blood transfusions. But there's a greater emphasis in Coppola's film, which I think again ties into the AIDS era. Transfusions, work with blood types. And in the next slide, there are a number of points in Coppola's film where he cuts to these images of blood under a microscope with these various cells moving back and forth, all of which I think, you don't have to think of them in terms of AIDS, but I think that element in the film is there if you're looking for it. So the next slide, this is something a little different. It has to do with really my own particular interest in the novel. It's not so much a later development of an addition to the reception history of Dracula, but it's part of the novel itself, that it's deeply embedded in religious matters, religious ideas. Show the next slide, for instance. So here's a scene from the Coppola film. And if you see, you might not notice it at first, but over on the left there on the wall is a portrait. And as we discover later in the film, this is a portrait of, the Count claims that it's a portrait of an ancestor, but I think it's pretty clear that it's a portrait of himself, even though it obviously dates back many centuries. And if we go to the next slide, when we have a close-up on it, if you know some art history, this portrait should ring all sorts of bells. If you look at the next slide, this is a very famous self-portrait by the great German painter Albrecht Dürer, and it's often called Self-Portrait as Christ. For a complicated set of reasons, Dürer is representing himself as a kind of Christ figure. And it's easy to support this argument if you just look at the next slide. There are all sorts of images you can find that predate Dürer's portrait, which show Christ in very much this pose. And the next slide is another painting of Dürer's, which again has sort of striking similarities with that self-portrait. So if we go to the next slide, this is from the script of Coppola's film, and I think this is part of what's going on in this. Why is it that Coppola is alluding to Dürer's self-portrait as Christ, which surely connects Dracula and Christ? It's because that's there in the novel. Or in the screenplay here, Dracula says at one point, the blood is the life and it shall be mine. Renfield, the character who keeps consuming life, says the blood is the life. And then even Van Helsing at one point says her blood is the life. And next slide. This is from the novel, Dr. Seward's diary. So Coppola obviously didn't invent this. he's talking about Renwick, his patient, who keeps repeating over and over again, the blood is the life, the blood is the life, the blood is the life. Well, what's significant about this? The next slide. This comes from the book of Deuteronomy. And it's actually a corruption of a prohibition in Deuteronomy that has to do with the Jewish dietary code. And in this instance, Jews are told, only be sure that thou eat not the blood, for the blood is the life, and thou mayest not eat the life with the flesh. So that already there's a sort of corruption of a biblical injunction in the Dracula story. But then if we go to the next slide, it gets even more peculiar, because in the Gospel of John, Jesus says to his disciples, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, ye have no life in you. Whoso eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is meat indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood dwelleth in me, and I in him. Jesus is overturning the prohibition in Deuteronomy, as Christianity does so often to Jewish law. Not only should you drink Christ's blood in the Eucharist, but Christ's blood is the key to eternal life. And Dracula's drinking of blood is, of course, the grotesque opposite of that. He drinks blood, but it's not Christ's blood, it's the blood of his victims. And it gives him an eternal life, but a life which is in fact an eternal death. And so this is something I'm fascinated with, all of this sort of religious language through the novel, and it gets picked up by later versions of the story. I think that's my last slide, and I'll sort of leave it there. Oh, no, well, this is just one of many images which shows you it almost sort of literalizes the theology of the Eucharist, with these angels collecting the blood from Christ's wounds in communion chalices. So that's it. That's enough for me.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We are going to open it up for our Q&A now. And just a reminder, attendees, you can submit questions and comments at any time by clicking on Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So our first question comes from Kim, who asks, what do you think of the 1931 George Melford Spanish film version of Todd Browning's Dracula compared to the American version with Bela Lugosi?
That's an easy question to answer. I don't know it. I know of it, but I haven't seen it. Does he have a comment on it? I mean,
yes, there's no comment here, but Kim, if you would like to add any comment, feel free to type that in the Q&A, and we can read that out. So feel free to submit that at any time. One question that I was wondering if you could both speak to is the way that technology and modernity sort of pervade the novel. You know, we see Seward especially with his phonograph, and even Mina with her shorthand. So how does that sort of impact the novel and the way that Stoker is telling the story?
Yeah, I mean, the novel is full of modernity. It's been called, you know, a novel in which characters save the world through office technology. It's a high-tech thriller. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the medical facet of it, the science facet, is just another facet of the high-tech phenomenon of this, but it is suffused with those references to modernity, which are put against the ancient superstitious being of the vampire. But yeah, that is absolutely part of its texture, and a major part of its texture.
And I'd say even that it's also the ancientness is also it's an alien ancientness, because it comes from the Far East, you know, the Carpathians and Transylvania, these areas so strange to Western Europeans or British. I think also my sense is too that the religious stuff in the novel is part of that world rather than the technological world. So it's interesting that even though they tried things like blood transfusions and other technological means of saving people or dealing with the vampire, what they have to go to is the host or the cross or these ancient talismans that have nothing to do with technology and everything to do with superstition or religion, depending on.
And another thing to add to that, the technology of shorthand and stenography and things like that. I mean, a lot of the pursuit of the vampire is facilitated through that. And interestingly enough, Dracula can't decipher shorthand, and neither can Van Helsing. And that inability to cope with modern technologies of that sort are sort of a key thing differentiating both of these characters from some of the other vampire hunters, and also one of the many, many strange links between Van Helsing and Dracula.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a comment from Brian who says, very interesting insights regarding religious and AIDS aspects of the films. Thank you. And Kim has added a comment about the Spanish version of Todd Browning's Dracula, saying it's more explicit for the time with more sexual innuendo, nicer costumes, better acting, and a longer version and cast entirely with Latino and Latina actors and shot entirely on the same set and using some of the same footage as Browning's. Was just curious what you thought. I think it's a better film, but who can't love Lugosi more?
That's very interesting. I'd love to see it, and I'll have to hunt it up. As iconic as the Todd Browning film is, it's really pretty clunky, they have some ridiculous special effects. There's sort of bats that are so obviously plastic. And Bela Lugosi, I'm kind of fond of Bela Lugosi, but he's a bit of a ham. So it may be that actually the Spanish film is the superior film. I'll have to check it out.
There's a lot of weirdness going on in the Browning novel, or in the Browning film as well. I mean, so many things that were central to the novel just are undone in the film. I'm thinking, for example, of the secrecy that Van Helsing insists upon. Well, in the film, he consults with a whole bunch of other doctors, and Lucy's transfusions take place in a surgical theater. I think about just the incredible, heavy-handed patriarchal themes that just fuse the Browning film. I mean, the patriarchs are just hammering down on that film. And Jonathan Harker is, he's replaced by Renfield those very opening scenes in which Jonathan might be seen as being kind of effeminized by his association with Dracula in the novel, and by his mental breakdown, his possibly having been fed on Dracula, certainly being unhinged, and that's taken out so that you can have a much more masculine, heteronormative Dracula in the film. And the film also, there are just things that don't make any sense if you don't, that seem to be thrown in as references to the novel that wouldn't make any sense unless you already know the novel. So I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of problems with that film.
No, I hear it.
But it was incredibly influential.
And I've never actually read the play that it was based on, and that would be interesting too, because it's obviously gone through transformations already before it even arrives on film. What you say about gender is fascinating, because, or men and women, because in rereading the novel, I was, Mina mentions a number of times the new woman, the sort of, the sort of the suffragette movement, and this sense of the sort of, there's almost a kind of what Victorian feminism that Mina's aware of and sort of connects to. And I didn't mention this, but in the Coppola film, I mean, if there's an eroticism between Harker and Dracula, there's a lot of eroticism between Mina and Lucy. They're all sort of running around in the rain in their nightgowns, and I think they actually kiss at one point in the rain. So that maybe, I mean, I'm not sure there's anything quite like that in the novel, but Coppola is obviously putting back a lot of the sort of what you might think of as sort of non-heteronormative into the story.
And a lot of people have, you know, there've been queer readings of the novel that have seen sort of an erotic undercurrent in the relationship between Mina and Lucy too. So yeah, I think I totally see where you're going with that.
There's also the interesting. It's in the Coppola film, but it's basically the same as it's in the novel. That moment in Castle Dracula where these three female vampires kind of descend on Jonathan in this sort of, I mean, it's erotic enough in the novel, but in the film, it's like crazy. But then Dracula comes busting in and says, "No, he's mine."
Yes, this man tonight is mine, and that was taken out, I think, of the American version in the novel. But yeah, you've got an incredibly erotic scene with the vamps and Jonathan Harker in the novel. But I just wanted to add on to Hannibal's point about the wound and that sort of thing. That's very eroticized in medieval literature. I often, when you have vampiric spirituality, I call it, when I teach some of those mystics and their obsessions with the wound and some of the iconography of the wound. So that's totally there.
We have a few comments responding to the different film versions. Kim says that Browning's version is very clunky, but gosh, what a classic. She personally likes Coppola's and Gary Oldman as Dracula the best, is fascinated by vampires, and did a paper on it in an English class at Ohio State. Patrick comments that Browning missed Lon Chaney. The film they like, but is clunky due much to Lugosi's mistiming. He's a stage actor like many of the silent actors who couldn't make the transition to talkies. And then one more comment, Kim adds, Dracula's Daughter in 1936 with Gloria Holden introduced the lesbian aspect to Dracula, but was tamped down a bit by the Hays Code back then.
Well, of course, you know,
Dracula's Daughter. Yeah.
The sexualization goes like all the way, because I mean, it goes into the realm of pornography, right? I mean, they're outright pornographic films, and then I mentioned all of that sort of soft porn stuff. That what is the I can't remember what the name of the show is, but it's like all the vampires are sort of young and buff, and they I don't know if it's Anne Rice who first opened this up, but at a certain point in vampire history, vampires are not only eroticized, but then they start having sex all the time, which always puzzled me, because I mean, I suppose, it would be silly to sort of raise questions about the realism of vampires, but I mean, is that something a living dead corpse should be able to do? Whatever.
Yep.
Our next question comes from Rachel. Any thoughts on the popularity of Dracula Daily during the pandemic?
Again, do you know about this, Karen? I don't.
I would love to know more about it.
Yep. Rachel, if you want to add anything in the Q&A, feel free. We also have a question from Masahide, who asks, given the Deuteronomy versus the Christian ritual of communion, is the argument that the novel is anti-Semitic strengthened? That's
interesting. I don't think, and I, you know, I don't have a sort of categorical statement on this, but my initial thought is that it's no more anti-Semitic than Christianity is in a very broad sense. That Christianity unavoidably overturns all sorts of things in Judaism. I mean, that the relationship between the Christian New Testament and Jewish scripture is seen as one. I mean, it's often talked about in terms of like fulfillment, but it really is an overturning of dietary code, of certain legal practices and things like that. I think that's different from what we tend to think of as anti-Semitism. I don't think there's a sort of anti-Jewishness so much as there's, and my sense too is that what Stoker's interested in is less the prohibition in Deuteronomy than the peculiar implications of the Eucharist, if you actually start thinking about what drinking Christ's blood means. And Stoker, of course, is Catholic, right? So, I mean, he's, he's not an English Protestant. I mean, according to Catholic theology, when you take communion, you are actually, in some real sense, consuming the body and blood of Christ. And, you know, that's a strange thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the Christian inversions are everywhere, as you say, Hannibal, and they're fascinating. But I don't detect a particularly anti-Semitic impulse in it, although I think it's been read that way. I don't read it that way.
It might, I mean, a more
certainly an anti. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say the same, that, you know, it's a sort of more generally anti-Eastern.
Yeah, the fear of the other, and the reverse colonization. The other may come back and invade you, and this is a threat, and on so many different levels. But yeah.
Rachel has shared the link to Dracula Daily, which I will put in the chat for anyone who would like to access. It looks like it was during the pandemic, pieces of Dracula were sent out based on the actual dates of all the entries in the actual novel. Dracula.
That's wild. That's terrific.
Yes, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's really amazing. That's a great way of looking at it, and also of sort of appreciating the timeline too, and sort of seeing that Lucy starts having symptoms before Dracula is ever on the scene, and you wouldn't really, unless you go back and you look at that timeline, you can't really sort of see that those connections there.
I wonder if you could both or either speak about the way that Bram Stoker uses language. There's a lot of dialect and a lot of foreign language that kind of plays into Dracula. Plus, Dracula speaks in almost perfect English. What's the impact that you see of that kind of playing with dialect and language throughout the novel?
It's an interesting question. I don't know what, I mean, I wonder whether, I was noticing all of this sort of Yorkshire dialect in rereading. I hadn't remembered that there was so much of that. Does that tie into that sense, that sort of opposition of the sort of ancient and folkloric versus the modern and technological? It is interesting too that the novel, that we're up in the north, which, or at least, it's, well, I don't know. Karen, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, the language is, I was thinking immediately of the dialects too, and Lucy and Mina especially, priding herself on her ability to reproduce those, which she does in her diaries. Mm-hmm. And, I'm thinking Van Helsing and his very obviously weird English, which marks him as a foreigner, and I think sort of possibly lends him a sort of suspect aura or allows him to be read in that way. I think Dracula is so fascinated because he's fixated with the language. And but it's very, very important. He doesn't think he speaks well enough. And what he wants is he wants to pass, and he can't pass with the English he's got. And so passing is a really, really important theme for him. So, and then we have another facet of the language, of course, is Jonathan Harker. And Jonathan Harker thinks, hey, you know, I can go and I can impress my employer and I can get around with just my polyglot dictionary. And of course, he's in huge trouble as he goes east because he doesn't understand things, and he might understand what people he might be able to look up what people are saying in the dictionary, but it doesn't make any sense to him because he doesn't understand the context. He doesn't understand the connotations. He doesn't understand any of that. And that just sort of lends to his kind of feeling of any unease and being really kind of out of his element, and which he is as he goes on this trip.
That's interesting too, that I mean, one thing that dictionaries have trouble with dialect. Like if you're using a sort of, you know, whatever it is nowadays, I think of Berlitz, but I'm sure that's long out of print. But you know, if you had a sort of English German or English Romanian dictionary, you wouldn't have a hope of understanding that old ship's captain in Whitby. And I'm put in mind I spent a summer at a Goethe Institute in Germany learning German, and felt very good about myself. And then a bunch of us went on a walk into the Black Forest, and we were sitting in this tavern, and this guy started talking, and I hadn't a clue what he was saying because it was thick local dialect. And so dialect is something that's much harder to learn. I don't know what that means in terms of the novel, but it's interesting.
Thank you so much. We've just got a couple minutes left. So in these final minutes, I'd just like to offer you both the opportunity to give some closing remarks on why Dracula endures.
One thing I was going to say, I'll throw this out, is when I was talking about these two different kinds of different representations of Dracula, the sort of inhuman monster, and then the kind of like sexy seducer, that they have, I think, different implications in terms of why the story appeals. If we're thinking about, I mean, if you think that the story in some sense is about like the possibility of eternal life, it's much better to think about an eternal life as a sort of sexy gigolo than as a kind of bat-eared monster. And I wonder if that's part of what's going on in recent adaptations, that they're making the fantasy much more congenial, because not only do you get to sort of continue in your top peak physical form, but you get to sort of hang out with and make out with all sorts of other people in their peak.
Yeah, I would say that I'm not sure. I'm just throwing this out. I wonder if Dracula would have endured in the same way that it did were it not for Bela Lugosi and that Todd Browning film, because it seems like, especially looking at Hannibal's presentation, it struck me how much of the modern conception of Dracula is informed by Lugosi's personality, and I'm not seeing as much of the Bram Stoker's novel in it. And it seems like there might be very much a parallel with Frankenstein, that in popular culture, what really endures is James Whale's movie version of it. So, and I'm not really sure that Mary Shelley sort of has sort of gotten lost. I don't know, just throwing that out there as Boris Karloff is what we remember from Frankenstein. So,
and for me, the great loss in that is that you know, and one of the most amazing things in Frankenstein, the novel, is that the monster comes to himself by reading Milton. I don't think that's in the Boris Karloff film.
No Milton, just
No.
cigars, smoke, friend, good. Yeah,
Right,
in Bride
and the
of
bolts in the
Frankenstein.
neck.
Oh, yes, yes.
Thank you both so much. A big virtual round of applause to Hannibal and Karen for sharing your time and expertise with us here today. And thank you so much to everyone who was able to join us this afternoon. We appreciate your time and your thoughtful questions. Everyone, stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you soon. Have a good one.